A very good morning from Bangkok, Thailand. My name is Cecilia Tinonin, and I'm a gender statistics specialist at the UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. And for the last 2 years, I had the pleasure and honor to chair the subcommittee on supervisory care. And today I have prepared a very short presentation to illustrate and share with you the key recommendations of the work of the subcommittee. Please allow me to share my screen. The Subcommittee on Supervisory Care was established in May 2021 within the wider ESPER Group on Time Use Statistics and was composed of representatives of national statistical offices from Canada, Colombia, Mexico, South Africa, United States, and representatives from ILO, UNICEF, UNSD, and UN Women. We had three key objectives. One was to develop a reference concept for the statistical measurement of supervisory care in official statistics, obviously, review country practices in official statistics and recommend a measurement strategy. And third, to identify headlines, indicators, and associated data uses. The primary purpose of the work of the subcommittee was that there was common agreement that the accurate measurement of gender data and more specifically care data needed further work, specifically when it comes to the measurement of minding dependence. Because as of today, enough knowledge has been developed to shed light on key measurement challenges. First of all, for some respondents, the provision of unpaid caregiving services can be associated with family responsibilities and the duty of care. As such, the respondent may omit the time spent on minding dependents, either adult or children, and as such not perceiving as an activity, but rather as a responsibility. There are instances in which respondents consider the provision of unpaid care services as a background activity that takes the whole day, and as such, we're referring to this type of occurrences as pervasive activity. In this context, the respondent may underreport the time spent on the provision of unpaid care work. So there was overall agreement that the traditional measurement approach of asking simply, what else were you doing, was helpful, but had some limitations in really capturing the time spent on minding dependent adult or children. So the first output of the work of the subcommittee was really to identify and further work on the reference concept of minding children supervisory care within obviously the context and the body of internationally agreed statistical standard. We agreed that unpaid supervisory care refers to the time the caregiver is in a hearing or visual proximity to a dependent household or family member to provide unpaid caregiving services should such need arise. The provision of supervisory care does not require the active involvement implied in the provision of those caregiving services where an interaction between the caregiver and dependent household or family member is needed. Supervisory care may occur at any location where the dependent household or family member is present and in close proximity with the caregiver. There is no requirement for bodily proximity of the caregiver with the dependent household and family member, such as being, for instance, in the same room. So there are key elements, let's unpack them together, of these definitions. The subgroup agreed quite immediately that the concept of supervisory care was to be conceptualized in terms of being on call. So drawing a parallelism with being on call, the working time spent on being on call for employment, for instance. Thus stressing the constraining nature of minding children, especially when this is not equally distributed among different actors. The key component of this concept are to be found in the fact that supervisory care falls under the SNA 2008 general boundary, and based on the third-party criterion is considered productive in an economic sense. We can all outsource the provision of minding children or dependent adult, for instance, to the market and hire a babysitter or a caregiver. We also agreed that the supervision and the time spent on supervising dependent is conditioned by physical location, proximity in space. This does not refer as to bodily proximity. The caregiver and the care dependent do not have to be in the same room, but close enough for the care dependent to react and provide active care should the need arise. It also maps a legal dimension of responsibility regarding supervisory care, especially of young children. And in this regard, the Supervisory Care Committee has been looked at this condition with special emphasis on supervisory child care. And we identify future work needed, for instance, a desk review of regulatory provisions that may be in place, for instance, for supervisory care for dependent adults or people living with disabilities. But the idea here is that young children cannot be left unattended, and dependent children, especially in young age groups, need supervision, not only in terms of providing them with active care and meeting their needs for survival, such as, for instance, feeding them or washing them, but they also need a caregiver, most likely parents, to really look after their safety, for instance. And in some countries, this concept as I said, a legal dimension of responsibilities. This concept does align with the several international statistical standards that are part already of the body of international agreed statistical standard. And I will get to that in a second, but I just want to further clarify the definitions and the scope of the definition, what it does include and what does exclude. So the provision of unpaid supervisory care includes instances when the beneficiary, could be the child or the dependent adult, is engaged in activities alone, including sleeping. We said that we don't have necessarily to be next to the child or the dependent adult, but we can be, for instance, in the same house and be engaged as caregivers in other activities. We also, at the conceptual level, identify that supervisory care does include instances when the caregiver is sleeping. And this is because the provision of unpaid supervisory care is a productive activity in an economic sense and could be outsourced, for instance, to the market, regardless of the day and time of the day. It also includes instances when the person providing unpaid supervisory care engages in other activities in parallel, including, for instance, remunerated activities. Nevertheless, the caregiver must remain accessible and in proximity should the need to provide active care arise. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with teleworking modalities and multitasking, as we all say. So, for instance, knowing that the child is in the other room playing, and meanwhile, we're working at our desk at home. It does also include instances when an individual is not necessarily interacting directly with the person being cared for, but is on call, should basically active care be needed. Provision of unpaid supervisory care does exclude time when the care provider gives active care, meaning that if I'm already interacting with the dependent, either the child or the dependent adult, I'm already, for instance, washing them or feeding them, then I'm obviously not providing supervisory care. Is embedded in the provision of active care services. As I was saying, this concept is aligned with previously agreed international statistical standard. More specifically, it draws a parallelism with the resolution concerning the measurement of working time. As I was mentioning, this is a concept that basically look at the time spent on being on call for the provision of unpaid caregiving services. It also aligns obviously with the resolution concerning statistics of work, employment, and labor underutilization. In terms of the treatment of unpaid supervisory care within ICATUS, basically is coded as group 416 and 425, which are group that looks at minding children and dependent adult respectively. It does exclude time spent on productive activities falling under ECATUS Major Division 4, as these activities measure the provision of active care. Having agreed on the definitions and concept and reference concept for the statistical measurement of supervisory care, we then look at how do we measure it, what countries' practices are available that could inform our recommendations. And we review country practices in official statistics, and we basically realized that the main approach, as I was mentioning earlier at the onset of my presentation, was really to ask the secondary activity questions. What else were you doing in the time use diary, especially? However, as mentioned, for the reason that I mentioned earlier, this was not considered enough because people tend to underreport, people tend to omit the provision of unpaid supervisory care. There was, however, one country practices that was particularly successful and illustrative of measurement strategies that could be recommended. And this is the American Time Use Surveys, which has a specific approach to measure secondary care, and that's an excellent example. The American Time Use Survey asks at the end of the diary a probing question, or also called summary question. Were children under the age of 13 in your care? This is carefully framed to avoid reference to any specific activity, and as I said, is asked after the regular diary is administered, and yet also tied to specific primary activities and time slot, meaning that after the diary is administered, we ask this probing question and is tied to specific activities and time slot. The time use survey in the US has conceptualized in your care as being on physical standby in case the child needs active care. It does involve being aware of what the child is doing and also carefully subtract time in which the respondent or all household children are asleep. And here I want to specify that in the definition of supervisory care, there is no requirement or strict requirement that the caregiver needs to be aware of what the child or the dependent adult is actually doing. The main and key requirement is proximity, hearing or seeing proximity. The country practices in the US has an important advantage over measures based on who else was present that report basically social time with children, because parents are often constrained by supervisory responsibility when children are in a other room or outside, and improves reporting. Indeed, Allard in 2007 compared the result obtained in time use surveys conducted in the United States at different points in time, including prior to this measurement strategy. And the authors found that while there was no major change in the time reported in primary activities, the increase in time reported from secondary care or supervisory care was very relevant when this probing question was actually introduced and included into the survey instrument. So the fundamental difference was that in the earlier time use studies that collected secondary activities, secondary childcare information was collected through the question, what else were you doing? While the American Time Use Survey introduced a number of questions which are, again, asked after the time diary is being completed, and ask respondent to report times and episodes during the diary day in which a child under age 13 was in your care. We as UN Women conducted cognitive testing in Mexico together with the Center of Excellence on Gender Statistics and El Colegio de Mexico. And we also actually arrive at the same conclusion. It's really important that time use instrument that aim at capturing supervisory care does include explicitly a probing question to capture the time spent on supervisory care, since respondents do not report spontaneously. To minimize burden and respondent fatigue, and when diary-based approaches are adopted, this probing question could be incorporated as a summary question following the American Time Use instrument design. The wording of the probing question is also extremely important. It should be clear enough for respondent to understand that caregiver should be in sufficient proximity to provide physical assistance when needed. Restrictive criteria of bodily proximity or too permissive criteria of, for instance, digitally mediated proximity should be ruled out to help respondent understand the scope of supervisory care. Indeed, in Mexico, we found that for certain caregiver, the fact that they could use a mobile phone, for instance, to call their children or video calling their children was considered by them a type of supervision and supervisory care. That is not aligned with the definition of supervisory care that was agreed by the committee, because as I said, the main criteria and requirement is that there is hearing proximity or sight proximity. Instrument design should include an explaining task that facilitates the conceptualization of supervisory care, ensures the understanding of questions, and therefore achieves a more reliable reporting on time devoted to supervisory care. In this regard, TMS instrument should provide supporting examples, survey vignettes to help respondents grasp the difference between active and supervisory care. And here we also recommend to conduct cognitive testing, especially for this probing question, even within countries. As we found that in different provinces and in different contexts, especially urban, rural, the language associated with supervisory care may change drastically. In terms of recommended headline indicators and potential data uses, the committee agreed not to revise the metadata for SDG 5.4.1, but it rather agreed on recommending additional indicators. The first one is a participation rate, which is a very common indicator in interview statistics and looks at the proportion of individuals who spend any amount of time in a day on supervisory care over the total population, disaggregated by sex, age groups, and location. The second is a volume-related indicator, the average time spent on supervisory care by total population in a day, by sex, age groups, and location. If additional resources are available, and the intention is really to shed a light on gender gaps in unpaid care work provisioning, an additional indicator is recommended, which is the average time spent on supervisory care only by participant population, meaning that the indicator takes into account only individuals that actually spent any time on the provision of unpaid supervisory care. One note that is very important to underline is that while at the conceptual level, supervisory care does include sleeping time of the caregiver because is considered a productive activity from an economic sense, for the computation of the indicators, supervisory care time excludes time spent on sleeping of the caregiver, does include time spent on sleeping by the care recipient. But it does not include sleeping time of the caregiver because there was a common worry that the indicators would end up being 24 hours for a very high amount of individuals. And also the supervisory care time does exclude, obviously, time spent on the provision of active care. Upon availability of resources and when feasible to present data on simultaneity, NSOs are also encouraged to disseminate data on supervisory care, disaggregated also by type of primary activity using ICATU's major divisions. And this is very important to shed light on joint household production, or commonly known as multitasking. So the amount of time that women and men spend, for instance, working while providing supervisory care in the background during their day. In terms of data uses, supervisory care data can input into satellite account of household production, can obviously inform a wide varieties of gender transformative policies, such as, for instance, improve the design of care policies, but also women economic empowerment policies and actions. As you all know, time surveys are very well positioned to inform a wide variety of gender gender-sensitive policies, not only related to the unpaid care provisioning within the household, but also, for instance, quality of life and work-life balance. And supervisory care data have definitely a role to play in informing this set of policies. So thank you so much. I'm aware this was a rather quick and high-level overview. For any further assistance, UN Women, also through our regional advisor in the Arab states, is definitely happy to support countries in further development of the methodology and implementation of measurement strategies for supervisory care, as well, obviously, technical assistance and capacity development in this area. I wish you a successful continuation, and thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye.